20 bullets, 7 men, 43 enemies closing from every direction through frozen mountain dark. Captain Ethan Cole pressed his back against the cliff and looked at his team. 2 men bleeding through their bandages. 1 radio crackling static. Ammunition running so low he could count every round in his head. The mortars had found their range. The drones had found their faces. Every exit was a killing ground. He pulled out the one device he had sworn he would never activate. His thumb hovered over the beacon. If I press this, everyone who comes for us dies too. He pressed it anyway. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the last frame of a movie, this channel was built for you. Hit subscribe right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like this video if you want to know what happens next. Because what comes out of that fog will change everything you think you know about what one person can do alone. Don't move. The Blackstone Range didn't care who you were. It didn't care about your rank, your training, your decorations, or the letters your mother kept in a shoebox back home. The range sat at 11,000 feet above sea level on the contested northern border, a wilderness of black granite spires and glacial ravines that had been killing soldiers for 3 generations. First in proxy wars nobody officially acknowledged, then in covert operations that never made it into any official record. The mountains were older than every nation that had ever tried to claim them, and they had a way of reminding men of that fact at the worst possible moment. Ethan Cole had been here before. That was the part that made his stomach tighten as Chalk 7 moved through the pre-dawn black, picking their way along a ridgeline that his topo map called a route and his boots called a nightmare. He was 34 years old, a captain with 12 years of service and 3 combat deployments that had left a collection of scars across his left forearm, a clicking in his right knee that flared in cold weather, and a psychological evaluation file that his commanding officer had described as thorough. He was not a large man, 5'10", lean, the kind of build that looked ordinary in civilian clothes and deceptively capable in kit. His eyes were the color of old river ice, pale gray blue, and they moved constantly. That was a habit you either developed early in this line of work or you didn't survive long enough to develop anything at all. Behind him, single file, came the 6 men he was responsible for keeping alive until dawn. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb moved directly at his 6, a former college linebacker from Georgia who had traded a football scholarship for an infantry contract and never once expressed regret. Webb was the team's senior NCO, 31 years old, built like a man who had been designed specifically for carrying heavy things uphill in the dark. He had a way of moving through difficult terrain that reminded Ethan of water finding its path. No wasted motion, no wasted energy. The other men respected him the way soldiers respect someone who has proven himself in the specific currency that matters in combat. Specialist Danny Reyes came next, 19 years old and the youngest member of the team by 4 years. He was slight, dark-haired, and possessed a natural talent for signals and electronic intelligence that had gotten him assigned to this reconnaissance element 6 months earlier. He carried the radio. He also carried the weight of being the new man, which in practice meant he kept his mouth shut, did his job without complaint, and tried not to look scared even when he was, which was often. Being scared wasn't the problem. Looking scared was the problem. He understood the distinction. Behind Reyes was Corporal Hatch Hutchinson, a former ranch hand from New Mexico who had learned to read terrain the way other people read text. His real name was Kevin, but no one had called him that since basic training. He read microterrain the way city people read street signs, naturally, constantly, without conscious effort. He was the team's point navigator, and he had twice already tonight redirected the column away from ground that looked passable on a map and proved impassable in reality. Then came Specialist First Class Leo Park, the medic. Korean-American, quiet, methodical. He moved with the particular alertness of someone whose job description included keeping other people alive, which meant he was always calculating. This man's heart rate, that man's hydration level, the angle of someone's stride that suggested a developing blister or a tweaked ankle. He had already, somewhere around the 3-hour mark, quietly redistributed 8 pounds of weight from Reyes's pack to his own, without making an announcement about it. Reyes hadn't noticed. Ethan had. Sergeant First Class Raymond Okafor came fifth, Nigerian-American, communication specialist, former Marine before he'd lateraled into special operations 3 years ago. He had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow from a piece of fragmented copper-jacketed round that had grazed him in a firefight in a country he wasn't officially in. He carried the secondary radio and the team's SATCOM antenna, broken down into 3 sections in his pack. He was the quietest man on the team, which Ethan had learned to interpret as focus rather than standoffishness. Last in the file was Sergeant Thomas Briggs, demolitions, 36 years old, perpetually dissatisfied with everything except explosives and strong coffee. He had the kind of dry, mordant humor that only functioned properly at the worst possible times. He complained constantly in training and never complained once in the field, which Ethan had learned meant that when Briggs went quiet in training, something was actually wrong. 7 men. 12 days into a 15-day reconnaissance mission. They had spent nearly 2 weeks mapping enemy supply routes along the northern ridgelines, cataloging vehicle traffic, noting patrol patterns, documenting the locations of what appeared to be forward supply caches hidden in the mountain passes. The information they carried was valuable. Their job was to carry it home. They were 4 hours from the extraction landing zone. But Hatch raised his fist. "Call 'em halt." Ethan dropped to one knee instantly, rifle up, scanning the darkness ahead. Beside him, Webb had materialized from the file as silently as smoke, already watching a different quadrant. The rest of the team went to ground in the boulders without a sound, which was one of those things that looked effortless from the outside and represented approximately 300 hours of combined training. 30 seconds of silence. A minute. Ethan low-crawled forward to where Hatch lay prone behind a granite outcrop, his head barely above the rock line. "What do you have?" Ethan murmured. Not a question. A prompt. Hatch pointed without raising his arm above the rock. 40 meters down the slope, where the ridge line folded into a shallow bowl before rising again toward the next peak, there was a shadow that didn't belong. Ethan raised his scope. The thermal signature was faint, a man-sized object, low to the ground, partially concealed behind a boulder, breathing slow, barely radiating. Someone who had been there long enough to equilibrate with the ambient temperature, which meant someone who had been waiting. Not patrol, Ethan's brain categorized automatically. Patrol moves. That's a sentry. Positioned. He shifted the scope. Another thermal bloom, this one to the left, then a third, further along the rim of the bowl. His stomach dropped. They're not on the ridge. They're in the bowl. They're on both sides of the bowl. His eyes moved fast, counting thermal signatures, reading spacing, interpreting the geometry of the positions with the sick, rapid clarity that his brain had developed for exactly this kind of math. This isn't a patrol route. This is a blocking position. And we just walked into the near end of it. He pulled back from the rock line and turned to find Webb already close, watching his face rather than the terrain, reading the expression. "How bad?" Webb said, barely above a breath. "We're compromised," Ethan said. "They know we're here. They were waiting." Webb absorbed this without visible reaction. Numbers. Counting thermals, minimum 15 in the bowl. Could be more. Can't see the far side of the ridgeline. Extraction? 4 hours out and we can't make the LZ through that bowl without walking into them. Webb looked at the darkness for 2 seconds. Options. "I'm working on it," Ethan said, which both of them understood to mean there aren't any yet. They went back 50 meters and got low in a cluster of boulders that offered sight lines in 3 directions and a cliff at their backs that offered nothing except the knowledge that they couldn't be flanked from that angle, which was a cold comfort when every other angle was still open. Ethan spread the topo map on his thigh and clicked on the red-lensed flashlight for 4 seconds, long enough to look, short enough to not matter. He triangulated their position against what the thermal signatures had told him. The bowl below them was the natural corridor through this section of the range. There was no other route to the extraction LZ that didn't add 18 hours in cross-terrain that was impassable in current conditions. The secondary LZ, a fallback extraction point 3 ridgelines to the east, was a 12-hour movement that would take them through the same enemy-held territory they had spent the last 12 days carefully avoiding. He clicked the flashlight off. "Okafor," he said quietly. Okafor was already there. "I've been trying. Satcom's getting interference. Atmospheric, maybe. Or deliberate. Try the burst radio." Tried. "Nothing's getting through the peaks." "The backup frequency?" A pause. "Static." Ethan looked at his watch. 0213 hours. The extraction aircraft were scheduled for 0610, 4 hours from now. If he could not move to the LZ and could not communicate with higher command to request an alternate extraction plan, his options were narrowing rapidly. He looked at Reyes. "Can you get anything through on the secondary antenna?" Reyes was already working. He had the radio open, adjusting frequencies with focused, quick hands. "The atmospheric interference is bad, sir. I might be able to punch through if I boost the signal, but it would be detectable." "How detectable?" "Anyone running a direction-finding rig in this sector would have us in 30 seconds. And then the people in the bowl would know exactly where we are." "Keep trying without boosting," Ethan said, "and keep it quiet." Then, from somewhere below them and to the south, a mortar tube coughed. The round came in fast, a high-angle shot that dropped into the ravine 30 meters below their position with a crack that split the mountain silence like a fist through glass. The pressure wave rolled over them, and Ethan felt it in his chest even from that distance. "They know roughly where we are. They're ranging." "Move," Ethan said. "Now. North face, behind the outcrop. Move." They moved fast and low, 7 men redistributing through darkness with practiced urgency, crossing 12 meters of open ground while the second mortar round was still in the air. It hit closer, 20 meters, maybe less. Rock fragments sang overhead. Ethan heard Reyes curse under his breath and then go silent, which was professional. They collapsed into the shelter of the north face outcrop as a third round found the spot they'd just vacated. "Contact south," Webb called out, just above a whisper. "Movement on the lower slope." The bowl wasn't just a blocking position. It was the anvil. The force coming up from the south was the hammer. Ethan had 30 seconds to understand the complete picture before it fully materialized, and then he understood it all at once with a clarity that felt almost calm. This is a coordinated ambush. They had our route. They waited for us. They're closing the box from 2 directions while a third element, those mortars, works by fire to fix our position. Someone had given them up, or they'd been tracked without knowing it. Either way, the how didn't matter right now. What mattered was the next 60 seconds. "Contact report," Ethan said quietly, and the team gave it fast. Webb watching the south slope, Hatch covering the west, Briggs and Okafor watching the approach from the bowl below. Reyes was on the radio, still trying. Park was low against the boulder, medical kit within reach. "I count 15 minimum on the southern approach," Webb said. "Moving in bounds, covering each other. These aren't irregulars." He was right. Irregulars didn't move in bounds. Irregulars didn't range mortars. Someone had sent professionals. "Ammunition," Ethan said. The count came back fast. 211 rounds total across the team. 6 magazines and change distributed across 7 men. 27 rounds average. In a sustained firefight against professional infantry, that was approximately 4 minutes of fighting before they were throwing rocks. "Drones," Hatch said flatly. Ethan looked up. The sound was there now. That specific high-pitched whine of a small reconnaissance UO-5, maybe 300 meters above them, moving in a slow oval pattern. Thermal imaging. Exact position reporting. Every time they moved, the drone reported their new coordinates to the mortar team. The box was closing. The drone was the eye. The mortars were keeping them fixed. The infantry was moving in. "Options," Webb said. Ethan considered. Breaking contact to the west meant crossing open ridgeline under drone observation while infantry followed and mortars walked along behind them. Breaking south meant running directly into the approaching element. East was the cliff. North was the bowl's blocking position. There were no options. There were only degrees of unacceptable. "We hold this position," Ethan said. "We make them pay for every meter, and we find a way to get a signal out." 200 rounds, Briggs said without emotion, just noting the fact. "I know what we have, Briggs." Yes, sir. A pause. Just making sure the math was mutual. They fought for an hour. It wasn't clean. It wasn't heroic. It was 7 exhausted men in the dark, cold to their bones, rationing every single shot with the grim arithmetic of people who have done the calculation and know how it ends. Ethan established a firing rotation, 2 men engaging at any given moment while the others conserved. He was measuring rounds the way a man dying of thirst measures water. Every enemy contact required a decision. Is this shot worth taking, or do we let them move and preserve the round for a better opportunity? You shot for effect, not for comfort. You waited until you were confident before you fired, which meant you let the threat get closer than felt safe, because you didn't have the luxury of warning shots. Webb dropped 2 soldiers from the southern approach at ranges that Ethan didn't ask about because the answers would have been uncomfortable. Hatch took a grazing wound across his upper left arm, a round that came out of the darkness from an unexpected angle and burned a furrow through his sleeve and the top layer of skin and muscle without penetrating deep. He made a sound like someone had stepped on him, then went back to watching his sector while Park slapped a pressure dressing on it without being asked. "How bad?" Ethan asked. "Burns," Hatch said. "I'm good. Tell me if that changes." "Yes, sir." The drone continued its oval overhead. The mortars continued to work, though they had shifted to a harassment pattern rather than direct assault. The enemy infantry was close enough now that dropping rounds on Ethan's position risked their own people. That was the one advantage of having the threat move in close. At 0347 hours, Okafor took a round through his left shoulder. It wasn't a graze. It went through, entered the front of the deltoid, exited the back, missing the subclavian artery by a margin that Park later described as enough, barely. Okafor didn't go down. He shifted the SATCOM antenna from his left hand to his right, adjusted his position and said, "I'm up," in a voice that was steady enough to be deliberate. He wasn't fine. His face was the color of old concrete and his breathing had gone shallow, and every time Park looked at him, Park's expression tightened in a specific way that didn't need interpretation. 10 minutes later, Briggs took shrapnel in his right thigh. A mortar fragment, not a bullet, which made a different kind of wound, irregular and ragged. He bound it himself, one-handed, with practiced efficiency, and did not stop watching his sector. 2 men down. Limited mobility. 211 rounds had become 23. 23 rounds for 7 men against an enemy element they could no longer accurately count. Ethan pulled back from the boulder line and let himself think. Not panic, not despair. Think. He had 30 seconds before the situation degraded further and he needed to use them. The extraction aircraft were at 0610. Current time, 0351. 2 hours and 19 minutes away and completely unable to fly through the fog that had rolled in from the east at 0300, sitting low and thick in the valley, grounding everything with rotors. SATCOM was still not getting through. The atmospheric interference was consistent. Possibly deliberate jamming, possibly just the particular hell of high-altitude electromagnetics in a mountain range at this hour. They had the backup beacon. The emergency distress transmitter, a small, flat device about the size of a deck of cards, sealed in orange polymer that broadcast on a dedicated military emergency frequency. It didn't need line of sight, it didn't need a SATCOM window. It just broadcast, loud and continuous, and anyone monitoring that frequency, and there were always people monitoring that frequency, would know exactly where the signal was coming from. The problem was that the beacon also told the enemy exactly where they were. The drone already knew that, so it was a moot point from one angle. But the beacon transmitted for a minimum of 6 hours once activated, which meant even if extraction came, the enemy would have a pinpoint fix on the LZ the entire time the helicopters were on the ground. It also meant that anyone who came to respond to the beacon was flying into an active combat zone with marked coordinates, which made it a signal that said, "Here we are, here they are, come and die with us." 23 rounds, 2 wounded men, an enemy force tightening a coordinated ambush that had been prepared specifically for them. He reached into the left chest pocket of his plate carrier, where the beacon had rested for 12 days without being touched, and he felt the weight of it in his palm. Small, solid, the last option dressed up as a device. Webb appeared at his shoulder, looking at the beacon without comment. "If we activate that," Webb said quietly, Whoever responds comes into this. I know. 2 hours until extraction window. Could be more than 2 hours with the fog. I know that too. Silence for 5 seconds. If we don't activate it, Webb continued, same quiet voice, same steady cadence, we've got about 4 minutes of fighting ammunition and 2 men who can't run. I've done the math, Marcus. Another silence. Yes, sir, Webb said. Nothing else. Ethan looked at the beacon in his hand. He thought about the pilots who would have to fly into that signal. He thought about Okafor's face and the color it was turning. He thought about Hatch's arm and whether the bleeding had actually stopped. He thought about Reyes, 19 years old, from Sacramento, who had a mother who wrote to him on actual paper and folded the letters into envelope corners and addressed them in careful cursive. He pressed the button. The beacon made no sound, no light. It simply became active, transmitting silently into the pre-dawn dark, a tiny voice calling into the void of the frozen mountains. This is Chalk 7, he told the silence. We're still here. He tucked the beacon back into his pocket and picked up his rifle. The enemy fire increased. They'd heard something, or their drone had detected the radio signal spike, or they were simply closing the final distance before dawn made the hunt more complicated. Rounds cracked against the granite above their position. Splinters of rock peppered the air. Webb returned fire twice, measured, deliberate, and went quiet again. 19 rounds left now. Ethan pressed himself against the rock and controlled his breathing and watched the darkness over the barrel of his rifle and thought, very quietly, in the part of his mind that he usually kept locked during operations. This might be how it ends. Not with a grand moment. Not with anything that would make a good story. Just a mountain in the dark, going cold and quiet, one round at a time. The minutes passed like weights being added to a scale. And then, a single rifle shot split the darkness from somewhere high in the peaks to the north, impossibly far, from a direction that nobody on either side of the fight had been watching. One of the enemy soldiers, a man who had been moving in a low crouch behind a boulder 40 meters from Ethan's position, close enough that Ethan had been preparing to deal with him using the last option available, simply collapsed. No drama, no warning, just fell. The way a man falls when the decision has already been made somewhere else. Ethan froze. Webb had gone completely still. The entire firefight seemed to pause for one full breath, as though the mountain itself was trying to figure out what had just happened. Chalk 7, Okafor said from somewhere to Ethan's left, his voice rough with pain but steady. Tell me that was one of ours. Ethan looked north, into the darkness, into the fog, into the jagged peaks that rose above their position and disappeared into the pre-dawn black. Nothing. No muzzle flash. No movement. No sound except the wind moving through the granite spires and the distant drone continuing its useless oval overhead. Negative, Ethan said slowly. That was not one of ours. The second shot came 6 seconds later. Another soldier down, further along the enemy line. A different angle, a different distance. 2 different firing positions. Ethan's brain processed automatically and then immediately revised, no. One position, moving between shots. Someone is repositioning between rounds and firing from different angles to prevent location. Someone out there, in the frozen dark, in terrain that was almost impossible to move through quietly, was hunting the people who were hunting them. And whoever it was, they were very, very good at it. Ethan pressed his back against the rock and felt something he hadn't felt in the last 4 hours. Not relief, not yet. Something more dangerous than relief. Hope. And then the third shot came, and an enemy machine gunner who had been repositioning to gain a flanking angle on their position never made it to his new firing point. And whatever was out there in the northern dark sent a message that every surviving soldier on the mountainside received at the same moment, loud and clear and unmistakable. The math just changed. The fourth shot came before anyone had finished processing the third. Ethan heard it, that distinctive crack thump of a high-powered rifle at distance. The supersonic snap of the round arriving before the sound of the shot itself caught up. And then a soldier on the eastern edge of the enemy line went down hard, spinning before he dropped, which told Ethan the round had come from the northwest, a completely different angle than the previous shots. One shooter. Moving fast through terrain that shouldn't allow fast movement. repositioning between rounds with a discipline and speed that Ethan had only seen a handful of times in his career, and never from a single operator working alone in the dark. The enemy knew it too. He could hear it in the way their fire pattern changed. The outward-facing aggression that had been closing on Chalk 7's position began redirecting, fragmenting, soldiers turning to look at the peaks behind them with the particular body language of men who have just realized they're caught between two threats and don't know which one to prioritize. That hesitation cost them. The fifth shot dropped a man who had been repositioning a light machine gun to engage the northern peaks. He was still moving when the round found him, which said something specific and unsettling about the shooter's ability to lead a moving target at distance, in the dark, with wind coming off the glacier to the northwest. Ethan had done the rough geometry in his head, and the shot had come from at least 800 meters, possibly more, at night, through fog, on a moving target. Webb appeared at Ethan's shoulder so quietly that Ethan almost brought his rifle up. "You seen this?" Webb said. Not a question. He'd been watching the same thing. "I'm seeing it." 800 meters, dark. Winds probably 12, 15 knots off the glacier. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I can't make that shot in daylight with a spotter and all day to prep. Neither can I." "So who can?" Ethan didn't answer because he didn't have an answer, and because the sixth shot had just fired from yet another position, east of the last one, which meant the shooter had moved 200 meters of broken mountain ridgeline in the time it had taken Ethan and Webb to exchange 4 sentences, which was either impossible or very close to it. "Okafor," Ethan called quietly. "Try the radio again." "Trying." Okafor's voice was thinner now, carrying the specific flatness of someone managing significant pain through the simple act of keeping their voice level. "Still nothing on primary. Secondary frequency is..." A pause. "Wait." Everyone waited. "I've got something," Okafor said. "Burst transmission. Encrypted. It's on the tertiary frequency." Ethan moved to him fast, crouching over the radio while Okafor worked the receiver with his good hand, his left arm immobile now, packed under pressure dressing. Park was watching from 2 meters away with the expression of a man calculating how much time he had before the situation moved beyond his ability to manage it. The burst transmission was short, compressed, encrypted, sent in a format that Ethan's radio could receive but couldn't fully decode without the proper key loaded. What came through was a partial clear text identifier appended to the transmission header, 3 characters that the system hadn't managed to encrypt before transmitting. RVN. Ethan stared at the 3 letters on the small display screen. "Raven," he said. Webb looked over his shoulder at the screen. "Is that a call sign?" "Has to be." "Whose?" Ethan shook his head. He didn't know. In 12 years of service across 3 combat theaters, he had accumulated a significant mental database of call signs, unit designators, operational code words. Raven wasn't in it. Whatever this operative was, whatever unit or organization they were operating under, it wasn't in any database Ethan had direct access to. The 7th shot fired, then the 8th, 9 seconds later. 2 rounds, 2 different angles, a pattern that was beginning to feel less like a sniper working and more like something systematic. Methodical dismantlement, working through the enemy position with the deliberate sequence of someone who has already mapped their targets and is simply working the list. The enemy's mortar crew fired once more, and then went silent. Ethan didn't know if the crew had been eliminated or had chosen to stop for fear of hitting their own people, but either way, the absence of mortar fire changed the immediate calculus significantly. "They're pulling back," Hatch said from his position on the western edge of the boulder cluster. His voice was tight. The arm was hurting him more than he was saying, but his eyes were still working. "Southern element. They're bound and covering away from our position." "Which direction?" Ethan asked. "East, back down the slope." Ethan processed this. The southern element was retreating. The bowl position to the north had gone quiet. No movement, no fire, which suggested they were either doing the same thing or they'd been ordered to hold and were now hesitant to advance without the southern element completing its part of the encirclement. The drone was still up, still circling, still watching, but the pressure had shifted. The tightening circle had developed a gap, and gaps were what you moved through when movement was possible. "Reyes," Ethan said. Can you raise anyone on any frequency? Reyes had been working the radio for the last 40 minutes with the focused intensity of someone who understands that the radio is the only thing standing between them and a permanent stay on this mountain. His fingers were cold. Ethan could see it in the slight imprecision of his movements, but his mind was still working. I think the jamming degraded, Reyes said. The atmospheric interference is still bad, but it's not as consistent. If we boost the signal, do it. Sir, they'll get a fix on us. They already have a fix on us. The drone has been reporting our position for the last hour. Boost it. Reyes boosted the signal and keyed the mic and began transmitting their authentication code and situation report in the clipped, precise format that he'd practiced until it was automatic. Position, strength, status, request. 23 words that carried everything anyone needed to know about Chalk 7's current situation. He transmitted twice, waited, transmitted again. And then, from somewhere in the static and interference and the ghost frequencies of mountain terrain, a voice came back. Faint, half-buried, requiring 2 passes through the filter to be sure of it, but unmistakably a voice. Chalk 7, this is Watchman. Authenticate. Reyes read back the counter-authentication. His hands weren't shaking, but his voice had gone very slightly higher than usual, which was the only tell he allowed himself. Authenticated, the voice said. Send your sitrep. They had comms. Ethan took the handset and spoke in the measured, structured cadence of a man who has done this under pressure and knows that clarity is the only thing that matters. Position, enemy strength, casualties, ammunition status. The beacon activation, the unknown shooter currently engaging the enemy element from the northern peaks. There was a pause on the other end when he finished. A pause just long enough to suggest that the person on the other end was taking a moment to absorb what they'd just heard. Say again your last, Watchman said. You have an unknown shooter engaging from your north? Affirmative. Call sign appears to be Raven. We received a partial burst transmission on tertiary frequency. Shooter has been engaging enemy infantry from multiple positions in the northern peaks for approximately, Ethan checked his watch, 22 minutes. High-value shots, precise, fast repositioning. Another pause. Chalk 7, stand by. The silence on the radio was different from the silence of the mountains. One was old and indifferent. The other was full of people making decisions. Ethan handed the handset back to Reyes and looked out at the slope. The southern element had retreated further. The drone's orbit was unchanged, but without the mortar crew and without the infantry advancing, the drone was observing rather than guiding. There was a difference. An observer gives information. A guide creates action. Right now, whoever was watching the drone feed was watching Raven work through their positions and making calculations that apparently weren't resulting in immediate action. The 9th shot. The 10th. Each one measured, unhurried, placed with a calm precision that Ethan found almost unsettling. There was no spray of covering fire, no panic shooting to force heads down, just rounds going to exactly where they were supposed to go, one after another, in a rhythm that suggested this was not significantly different from any other problem the shooter had encountered and solved. Ethan looked at Webb. Whoever that is, Webb said quietly, they're running a full engagement from a solo position in terrain that a 2-man team would struggle to move through. And they're doing it at night. Yeah. What does that tell you? Ethan thought about it for a moment. It tells me they've been up here for a while. They know this ground. They prepped positions ahead of time, or they're exploiting terrain they've already mapped. Prepped positions, Webb said, turning the phrase over. So they weren't here because of us. No, Ethan said. They were already here, for something else. And they chose to do this instead. Webb let that sit for a few seconds. That's an expensive choice. Yes, it is. What Webb meant and what Ethan understood was that an operative who abandons an existing mission to intervene in someone else's firefight is making a professional sacrifice that has consequences. Missions don't just resume. Operations have windows. If Raven was on an active assignment in this sector and had pulled away from it to engage Chalk 7's pursuers, then Raven had made a decision that would be very difficult to explain to whoever was waiting for results on the original task. It was not the decision of someone who had calculated the personal cost and found it acceptable. It was the decision of someone who hadn't stopped to calculate at all. The 11th shot came from further west than any previous shot, which meant the shooter had crossed a significant piece of ridgeline in the dark, terrain that Ethan could see from his position, dark, jagged stone that caught no ambient light and offered footing that ranged from bad to actively dangerous. "Watchman, Chalk 7, Reyes said, pulling Ethan's attention back. "They're back." Ethan took the handset. "Chalk 7, Watchman, we cannot confirm or deny any assets in your sector. Extraction timeline is weather dependent. Current conditions have LZ access estimated at 90 to 110 minutes from now. Be advised we are aware of your beacon status. Advise you hold position and conserve what you have. Watchman, we have 2 casualties with limited mobility. Current ammunition, we copy your status, Chalk 7. Hold what you have. The situation in your area appears to be developing. Appears to be developing. In military radio language, that was as close as it came to someone is doing something, and we're watching it, and we're not going to tell you what it is. Ethan had used that phrase himself from the other end, from inside a command center, watching a drone feed of someone else's bad situation and knowing more than he could say on an open channel. It was a profoundly uncomfortable phrase to receive. He handed the handset back and checked his ammunition. 17 rounds. He had been shooting conservatively for the last hour, and he had 17 rounds left, and 2 of his men couldn't run, and the extraction was 90 minutes away minimum. He checked the position again. The bowl to the north was still quiet. The southern slope showed no movement. The drone overhead continued its oval, 14 seconds of silence on the mountain, which was the longest sustained silence since the ambush had begun. And then, from the eastern rim of the bowl, the position that the blocking element had been holding for the last hour without engaging, there was suddenly a great deal of noise all at once. Gunfire, yes, but not directed at Chalk 7. Directed inward, into the bowl, where 2 enemy soldiers had apparently been attempting to use the silence as cover to reposition, and had discovered that silence doesn't protect you from someone who already knows where you are. Raven had crossed the ridgeline and come around behind the bowl. Ethan understood the geometry of what was happening, and it hit him with a force that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite disbelief, but lived somewhere between them. The shooter had not simply been maintaining a defensive position in the north, suppressing threats as they appeared. They had been reading the entire battlefield, identifying the blocking position, calculating the timeline of the encirclement, and then deciding to collapse the northern element before it could be used. Alone. In the dark. On terrain that Ethan wouldn't want to cross in daylight with a full night's sleep and no one trying to kill him. "Webb," Ethan said. "I see it," Webb said. He was watching the bowl's rim with his scope, jaw set, processing the same geometry. "They're going to clear that position. Can we support?" Webb looked at Ethan, then at the ammunition count that both of them were carrying in their heads. "We've got 17 rounds between us. I mean between you, me, and anyone still functional." He paused. "We could, but if we start shooting in that direction and our shooter is moving through that area, we'd be shooting at our own support. Fratricide in the dark is a bad outcome." "Agreed." Ethan looked at the bowl. "We hold. We watch. We're ready if anything comes this direction. And if the unknown shooter runs out of mountain, then we use what we have and we make it count." The firefight in the bowl lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds by Ethan's count. He didn't fire a single round during those 4 minutes. He watched, controlled his breathing, and cataloged what he was observing with the part of his brain that never fully stopped running. Analysis, even when the rest of him was afraid. The enemy blocking element was not small. He counted at least 8 distinct firing positions before the return fire from those positions began to diminish, then diminished further. Then, at the 3-minute mark, went sporadic. Then, at 4 minutes and 11 seconds, stopped. Complete quiet from the bowl. Not the quiet of men waiting to move. Not the quiet of men managing their noise discipline. The quiet of a position that had been emptied. Reyes exhaled slowly, a long, controlled breath that he'd apparently been holding for the last 3 minutes without being fully aware of it. Park checked Okafor's dressing, pressing 2 fingers against his wrist without comment. Briggs shifted his weight off his wounded leg and made a sound that was mostly suppressed, but not entirely. That's a 6 to 8 man element, Hatch said quietly from his position on the west, cleared by a single shooter. No one responded to that because there wasn't anything useful to say about it. Ethan was watching the ridgeline to the north when movement appeared. A single figure, emerging from a crease in the rock face 200 meters out, moving along the rim of the bowl with a low, efficient stride that spoke of someone who had done a great deal of moving in difficult terrain and had long since stopped thinking consciously about it. The figure was carrying a long rifle. Even at 200 meters in pre-dawn dark, the outline was unmistakable, and moving with a purpose and a speed that Ethan's tired brain took a moment to fully register, moving toward them. "Weapons up," Webb said quietly, and 7 hands moved, which was the appropriate response when an unknown figure approached your position in a combat zone, regardless of what that figure had just done on your behalf. The figure slowed as it approached, not stopping, but slowing and raising one hand in the deliberate, flat-palmed gesture that anyone with military training recognized immediately as a challenge response. "I know you're watching me. I know you're considering your options. I am telling you that I'm aware of the situation." "Challenge," Ethan called out, quiet but carrying. "Nightfall," the figure said, without breaking stride. That was the correct response to the current challenge word for this sector, which was a piece of information that was not publicly available and not casually knowable, and which told Ethan everything he needed to know about the figure's access and clearance level before they were close enough to see each other's faces. He lowered his rifle. The rest of the team did the same, though Webb kept his eyes on the approaching figure with the particular expression of a man who isn't fully convinced yet and won't be until he decides to be. Raven was close enough now to see in the ambient pre-dawn gray, and what Ethan saw was not what any of them had been imagining, though he realized immediately that they hadn't actually been imagining anything specific because none of them had allowed themselves that luxury. She was, and he processed this without any particular reaction, simply noted it as a data point. A woman, perhaps 30, perhaps a hard-lived 27. Medium height, lean with the functional, durable leanness of someone who covers a lot of ground in difficult conditions. Her face was wind-burned, her dark hair pulled back severely under a watch cap, and she wore an unmarked tactical setup that carried no identifying insignia, no flag patch, nothing that would tell you what organization had sent her, or whether any organization had sent her at all. She moved like she was used to moving through places that were not expecting her. She stopped 6 feet from Ethan and looked at him with dark, direct eyes that were doing their own rapid assessment and weren't making any attempt to conceal it. "Captain," she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone who regulates everything. "You're Raven." "That's what I'm called." She glanced past him at the team, clocking injuries, counting heads, reading the ammunition status from the way people were holding their weapons. 2 wounded. "You're mobile?" "Slow," Ethan said. "Not stationary." "Extraction timeline?" 80 minutes, maybe less. Weather dependent." She nodded once. The southern element pulled back about 400 meters. They have a command element with them, someone making decisions. That someone is going to reorganize and they're going to try again before your birds get here. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they're arguing about it. Webb had come up beside Ethan, and Ethan could feel the particular quality of Webb's attention without looking at him. That focused, calculating silence that was Webb's version of very serious skepticism. "You just cleared an 8-man blocking position," Webb said. It came out less like a statement and more like a question he wasn't fully sure how to phrase. Raven looked at him without any detectable expression. 6-man. 2 of them relocated before I got there." "Where'd they go?" "West. They're not coming back." Webb absorbed this. "And the southern element. You were tracking them while you were clearing the bowl?" "I was tracking everything," she said, with the particular patience of someone who is choosing to answer questions they don't technically owe answers to. "That's the job." "Whose job?" Webb said. "Because I've never heard of you, and I know a lot of people." A short pause. "Then you don't know enough people." Ethan stepped in before Webb could respond. "Can we make the LZ?" Raven shifted back to him. "With your wounded? Not the original route. There's a secondary approach. Longer, adds about 40 minutes to your movement, but it avoids the terrain they'll try to use to cut you off." She unslung the rifle and looked at Ethan with those direct, unreadable eyes. I'll take point. Your sergeant walks your casualties. You bring the back end. You're coming with us? I'm getting you to your helicopter, she said. What I do after that is my business. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He had a dozen questions and no time for any of them. All right, he said. We move in 90 seconds. Tell me about the secondary route. She told him. It came out in crisp, precise language. Distances, terrain features, choke points, where to move fast and where to go slow, exactly the kind of brief that told Ethan she had been through this particular section of ground before and had done it with enough attention to detail to remember specifics. Not a scout's overview, a practitioner's knowledge. He filed the questions away for later and turned to his team. On your feet, he said. We're moving. Okafor stood with Park's hand under his good arm, getting his legs under him with an effort that he didn't show on his face, but that Park tracked with careful, clinical attention. Briggs put weight on the wounded leg, grunted once, and said nothing. Hatch rolled his shoulder and didn't look at the blood that had soaked through the pressure dressing and darkened his sleeve. Reyes was already breaking down the radio antenna, hands quick and automatic. Raven had moved to the northern edge of the boulder cluster, low against the rock, watching the ridgeline the way a person watches something they have already decided how to handle. Ethan checked his 17 rounds. Checked the beacon, still transmitting in his chest pocket. Checked the time. 78 minutes to the extraction window, assuming the fog lifted, assuming the pilots could see the LZ, assuming the southern element didn't find them first and close the gap before they could reach open ground. He looked at the woman at the edge of his position, the stranger who had come out of the frozen dark and dismantled an ambush that had been built specifically to kill 7 people, and had done it alone, and was now apparently willing to spend the next 40 minutes walking point through enemy territory to get them to a helicopter she wasn't going to be on. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who she worked for. He didn't know what she had walked away from to be here, or what it would cost her. What he knew was that Okafor's blood pressure was dropping, and Briggs could barely walk, and the southern element was reorganizing 400 meters down the slope. Raven, he said. She looked back. Lead us out. She turned north and moved without another word, and Chalk 7 followed her into the dark. She moved through the dark like she'd memorized it. Not fast. Fast would have been wrong on this terrain. Wrong with 2 wounded men behind her. Wrong with the kind of ground that punished carelessness at night by simply removing the person who made the mistake. She moved at exactly the pace the ground allowed. Not one step slower, not one step faster. Reading the terrain with her feet the way other people read with their eyes. Picking the line through the boulders and the ice-slicked rock with a certainty that Ethan found mildly unsettling, given that he couldn't see what she was seeing. He was on her 6, close enough to track her movement, but not so close that he'd run into her if she stopped suddenly. Behind him came the rest of Chalk 7 in the same single-file discipline they'd maintained all night, though the file moved differently now. Slower on the left side where Park had his arm under Okafor's, shorter steps from Briggs, who was managing a damaged leg with the grim mechanical focus of a man who has decided that pain is information, and information can be ignored when necessary. They had been moving for 11 minutes when Raven stopped. Not a gradual slowing. A full stop, hand coming up in the halt signal, weight distributing instantly between both feet like she'd been standing there for an hour. Ethan stopped behind her and went down to one knee, and the rest of the column folded up behind him with the trained-in quiet that he was deeply grateful for in this particular moment. He waited. She was looking at something to the east, not moving her head, just her eyes, the way you look when you don't want the movement of your skull to break your own silhouette against whatever ambient light is available. Ethan looked too. The pre-dawn dark had lightened barely perceptibly, not enough to call it dawn, just enough to reduce the absolute black to something closer to deep gray, the kind of light that was almost worse than no light, because it showed you shapes without showing you details. He saw the ridge. He saw the rock face angling down into the ravine. He saw the silhouettes of granite formations that had probably looked the same for 10,000 years. He didn't see what she was seeing. She turned her head by 2 degrees and looked at him. Then she pointed, 2 fingers, index and middle, directed toward a specific point on the eastern ridge. Then she held up 2 fingers. Then she spread her hand flat and moved it slowly in the universal gesture, for they're stationary but they're watching. 2 sentries. Eastern Ridge. Watching the ravine below, which was the ravine that Chalk 7's original extraction route would have taken them through, and which told Ethan immediately that the southern element hadn't just pulled back to reorganize. They'd split off a forward element to cover the most obvious route while the main body regrouped. He leaned close to Raven's ear. Alternate. She was already moving, shifting her weight left, beginning a slow diagonal traverse that would take them further north before looping back toward the LZ. More distance. More time. But the sentries on the eastern ridge would never see them, and 2 sentries who don't see you can't call back your position to the command element that's looking for you. The traverse took 19 minutes, and it was the hardest 19 minutes of movement Ethan could remember in recent operational history, which was saying something. The terrain on the northern traverse was bad. Genuinely bad. The kind of ground where every step required a conscious decision about placement, where the rock was either too smooth and angled or broken into loose fragments that shifted under weight and tried to send noise downslope to wherever the sentries were listening. Briggs was breathing through his nose in the controlled way that people breathe when they are managing something that wants very much to become a sound, and Okafor had stopped making any sound at all, which was either excellent noise discipline or something that needed immediate attention, and Park seemed to understand which one it was because he stayed within arm's reach of Okafor for the entire traverse without breaking his own noise discipline. At the end of the traverse, Raven stopped again and looked back at the column, and her eyes moved to Okafor with the quick, assessing look of someone who does this kind of triage calculation automatically. "How long can he go?" she said, directing the question at Ethan, but looking at Park. Park answered, "He needs a field transfusion inside 30 minutes. After that, I'm managing a different problem." Raven looked at her watch, then at the sky, then back at Ethan. "We're 40 minutes from the LZ at current pace." "Then we increase pace," Ethan said. "Through this terrain with him, that's not a recommendation I'd make." "I didn't ask for a recommendation." She looked at him for 1 second with those level, unreadable eyes. Then she looked at the terrain ahead, and she looked at Okafor, and she did some calculation that Ethan wasn't party to, and then she turned back to the route. "Shorter line," she said. "It crosses more open ground. They'll have visibility on us for about 90 seconds in one section." "How open?" 100-meter rock shelf. No cover. If anyone's watching that section with thermals, we're visible." Ethan looked at Okafor. Park had 2 fingers on his wrist, and his expression was doing that tightening thing. "Take the shorter line," Ethan said. She took it. The open shelf came at the 23-minute mark, and it was exactly as exposed as she'd described. A flat plate of granite that jutted from the mountainside like a table. 100 meters of nothing to hide behind, open to the eastern ridge and the sky above and the slope below. Ethan looked at it and felt the specific quality of exposure that combat soldiers learn to feel in their skin before their brain fully articulates it. The sense of being visible that is almost physical. "Fast as we can go without making noise," Raven said quietly, already stepping onto the shelf. They crossed it in a staggered line, Raven on point and moving with a contained urgency. Ethan behind her, the team behind him. Park and Okafor moved in something between a jog and a controlled stumble, Park bearing more of the weight than he should have been able to over uncertain footing. Briggs was covering ground on a leg that had to be screaming at him by now, and he covered it without falling and without making a sound about it. 60 meters across. 70. The drone found them at 80. Ethan heard it before he saw it. That distinctive high-pitched whine dropping in from the northeast, lower than the original drone had been flying, which meant either this was a second drone brought in at lower altitude for better thermal resolution, or the original drone had descended to confirm a contact. "Run," Raven said. They ran. The last 20 meters of the shelf disappeared under boots that were no longer worrying about noise, just speed, and they came off the shelf's far edge and into the cover of a jumble of granite boulders, and Ethan pressed his back against rock and caught his breath in 2 controlled counts and checked the team. All 7, plus Raven. Nobody down. The drone was overhead now, circling. They were in the thermal shadow of the boulders, not invisible, but harder to resolve. And the drone held its circle for 40 seconds and then began to move south, toward where the command element presumably was, carrying its contact report. "They know we're here," Webb said, from Ethan's right. "They knew before," Raven said. She was scanning the slope below them through a small optic on her rifle, working through sectors. Now they know we're moving faster than expected. They'll push the reorganization. How much time does that buy us? Not enough. She lowered the rifle slightly. They have vehicles. That was new information that landed badly. What kind? Ethan said. Light armor, 2 of them. I saw them positioned in the valley when I was working the northern ridge. They weren't moving then because the approach route was too narrow. She paused. The route we just took out of the bowl opens up in about 600 meters into a valley floor, wide enough for vehicles. Ethan ran the calculation. 600 meters of descent, then open valley floor with a direct line to the LZ. LZ that was going to have helicopters landing on it in, he checked his watch, 51 minutes if the weather held. Light armored vehicles on the valley floor meant that those helicopters would be landing into direct fire from weapons that a few individual rifles with 17 rounds combined could not meaningfully contest. Show me the vehicles, he said. She handed him the optic without comment. He found the valley floor below, followed the ridgeline south, found the road, not much of a road, barely a vehicle track, and found the 2 vehicles. They were sitting hull down behind a rise in the terrain, positioned to push forward into the valley at a moment of their choosing, which was an intelligent placement. They'd been put there by someone who understood ground. If those vehicles get into the valley before our birds get there, Ethan said, we have a problem we can't shoot our way out of. Yes, Raven said. Just that. He handed the optic back. He looked at his team. He looked at what he had. 17 rounds, 2 casualties, 1 unknown operative, a radio, and a beacon that was still singing into the dark. Watchmen, Chalk 7, Reyes said into the radio, and his voice was doing that controlled high thing again. We have a vehicle threat. 2 light armor, valley floor, grid. He read the grid. The response came back faster than Ethan expected, which told him that Watchman was watching their beacon track and had been monitoring the situation more closely than the previous radio exchange had suggested. Chalk 7, Watchman, we copy your vehicle threat. Be advised we have no available fire support in range. Repeat, no fire support available. Extraction birds are inbound. ETA 53 minutes. Best speed to LZ. No fire support. Ethan took that information and put it where it needed to go and didn't spend time on it. Copy, Watchman. Moving to LZ. He looked at Raven. She was looking at the valley, at the vehicles, at the route between their current position and the landing zone, which ran through the part of the valley that the vehicles could reach before the helicopters did. If they push into the valley in the next 20 minutes, she said slowly, working through it out loud, they'll be at the LZ before extraction arrives. Your birds come in, they're flying into an ambush. I know. You don't have anything to stop them with. I know that too. A silence. Down the slope, the drone had completed its circuit and was heading back their direction, which meant the command element had received a contact report and was acting on it, which meant the vehicles would move soon. I can slow them, Raven said. Ethan looked at her. How? I need to get down to the valley floor. The road they're using has a choke point. There's a section where the track narrows between 2 rock formations, about 900 meters from here, below their current position. She was calculating as she spoke, her eyes working the terrain. If I get there first and take out the lead vehicle, the second vehicle can't get around it. That road is the only mechanized approach into the valley. Ethan did the distance math. 900 meters, mostly downslope, in maybe 20 minutes if she moved without slowing. The vehicles would push forward when the command element gave the order, which could be any time in the next 10 to 15 minutes. The timing was possible. It was possible the way jumping a gap that was almost within reach was possible. Technically, achievable, carrying significant consequences for the failure case. You'd be in the open, Ethan said, below their position. If they see you before you get to the choke point, then they see me, she said. That's the job. Webb was listening. He spoke without looking at Raven, still watching the slope. What do you hit them with? You're running anti-armor rounds in that rifle? No, she said. Then how? The commander, she said. Not the vehicles. You don't need to kill a vehicle. You need to kill the decision. The lead vehicle loses its commander, they stop. They reorganize. They wait for orders. Every military unit does that. It's trained into them. By the time someone else assumes command and issues new orders, your extraction window opens. Ethan stared at her. It was not the wrong analysis. It was, in fact, a precise and accurate analysis of how armored vehicle crews behaved under unexpected command disruption. He'd studied the research. He'd seen it in practice. You kill the lead vehicle, and they go around it, or they push it aside. You kill the commander, and the vehicle stops, because the vehicle is a platform. And a platform needs a person making decisions. But it required a shot, probably multiple shots, on a moving target inside a vehicle, from 900 meters, in deteriorating light conditions, on a route she'd never fired from, with a wind that was picking up off the glacier. "You can make that shot," he said. Again, not quite a question. She looked at him. "Yes." Webb turned his head and looked at her then, and his expression was the one Ethan had seen on Webb's face exactly twice before in 3 years. When Webb had watched a combat diver go into water that was almost certainly fatal and come back out, and when he'd watched a pilot put a damaged aircraft down in a space that it shouldn't have fit in. The expression of a man recalibrating what he thought was possible. "Go," Ethan said. She was already moving before the word was fully out, slipping between the boulders and angling down the slope with the same quiet, purposeful speed she'd used all night. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She went into the gray dark below, and the gray dark accepted her, and within 40 seconds Ethan couldn't pick her out from the terrain anymore. "All right," he said, turning to his team. "We move. Same order, faster pace. We need to be at the LZ when those birds arrive." "What about the vehicles?" Hatch said. "She's handling the vehicles." Hatch processed this and apparently decided that it was a reasonable allocation of responsibility given the available options, because he didn't say anything else and got to his feet. They moved. The descent was harder than the traverse had been, steeper, and the morning cold had put a skin of ice on anything that retained moisture overnight, which in these mountains was most surfaces. Briggs went down once, caught himself on his hands, and came back up without a sound and without stopping. Okafor was moving under his own power in a technical sense, but Park had shifted from supporting him to essentially carrying him on one side, and the math of two men moving as one on an icy downslope was the kind of math that required constant adjustment and produced a lot of near misses that resolved through luck and reflexes and Park's insistence on staying planted. Ethan was watching the valley floor through every gap in the terrain as they descended, tracking the vehicles, tracking the light, tracking the timing. The pre-dawn gray was deepening into something closer to actual dawn, the sky lightening in the east above the peaks in a way that changed the visibility calculation. Better for the pilots trying to find the LZ, worse for anyone trying to move undetected across open ground. The vehicles were still stationary when Ethan got his next clear view of them, 7 minutes into the descent. The drone was back overhead, orbiting, and he'd stopped worrying about the drone because there was nothing to do about it, and worrying about something you can't affect is a waste of processing power. He was watching the vehicles when the first shot came. A single crack from the southwest, from the direction of the road's choke point, a distance that Ethan estimated at over 900 meters from their current position, which put Raven's firing point well over 1,000 meters from the vehicles. The lead vehicle's commander, who had been standing in the open hatch, dropped into the vehicle. The vehicle stopped. Ethan watched through Raven's optic, which he still had, and he saw exactly what she had predicted. The second vehicle braked. The spacing between them froze, and for 20 seconds, nothing moved. The crews were inside, presumably talking on their internal comms, presumably trying to determine what had just happened and what they were supposed to do about it now that the person who knew the answer was no longer answering. The second shot came 11 seconds after the first, and Ethan saw an antenna array on the lead vehicle's roof disintegrate, which told him that Raven had identified the vehicle's communications equipment as the second priority target. Cut the commander, cut the comms, and what you have left is a sealed metal box full of people who are completely isolated from any direction. "She's buying us time," Webb said, close to Ethan's ear. "Keep moving," Ethan said. They kept moving. The vehicles remained stationary as Chalk 7 descended the last 400 meters to the valley floor, which was either a tribute to the paralytic effect of command disruption or evidence that whoever had taken over from the dead or wounded commander was choosing extreme caution, or both. The drone continued its orbit, but no fire came, which Ethan interpreted as the command element being unwilling to engage with air assets while they had 2 immobilized vehicles and no clear comms with their armor crews. The valley floor was open and they crossed it, moving fast and low, using what little ground cover existed, and Ethan was counting down in his head. Extraction window, current time, distance to LZ, when Reyes came up beside him with the radio handset extended. Watchman, for you. Ethan took it without breaking stride. Go. Chalk 7, Watchman, we have your beacon position. Birds are 6 minutes out. LZ is clear per latest imagery. Be advised, we are tracking 2 stationary vehicles at your 6 grid. The voice read the grid, which matched where Ethan had last seen them. What is their status? Stationary, Ethan said. Command disruption. Unknown duration. A beat. Copy that. How? Unknown shooter. Call sign Raven. Another beat, longer this time. Copy. 6 minutes, Chalk 7. Mark your LZ. Ethan handed the handset back to Reyes and looked at the LZ. A flat section of valley floor, maybe 70 meters across, bounded on 3 sides by low rock ridges and open to the south. He could see it from here, 200 meters ahead. He could see it, and the helicopters weren't there yet, and the vehicles were behind them, and the drone was still up, and the light was coming, and everything depended on the next 6 minutes being the right 6 minutes. He thought about Raven. Somewhere to the southwest, still on the slope, having fired at least twice from a position below and behind the enemy's armor element, which meant she was in terrain that the vehicles could move through if their command situation resolved itself in the next 6 minutes. Okafor, he said, without turning. You with me? Moving, sir. The voice was thin but there. 200 meters, then we're done. He didn't hear a response, but he heard footsteps behind him continuing, which was enough. They reached the LZ with 4 minutes to spare by Ethan's count, and he pulled out the IR strobe from his kit and activated it. Invisible to the naked eye, blazing like a torch to any aircraft with the right equipment, and placed it in the center of the flat ground and moved back to the edge where his team was spread in a loose perimeter watching the ridgelines. The vehicles were still stationary. The drone was still up. The eastern ridge was quiet. 3 minutes. Webb came to Ethan's side. Where is she? I don't know, Ethan said. We're not leaving without... I know that, Marcus. Webb went quiet. He was watching the southwestern approach, which was where Raven would come from if she was coming, which was currently an open question. 2 minutes. The sound of rotors reached them first, that distant rhythmic thrum that Ethan had been listening for his entire life in moments like this, had heard it in 2 countries before this one, and had each time felt the same precise cocktail of relief and remaining tension, because a helicopter arriving was not the same as a helicopter having landed and taken off again with everyone on board. 1 minute. The first helicopter crested the southern ridgeline at low altitude, running without lights except for the IR that only its crew could see, and Ethan's hand went up to mark the LZ, and the pilot adjusted, and the aircraft came down in the flat ground in a controlled, purposeful descent, with the second aircraft holding above in a wide orbit, watching. The door gunner had the M240 up and scanning before the skids touched. Move, Ethan said, and turned to his team. Park and Okafor moved first, Okafor being handed through the helicopter door by Park and one of the crew. Then Reyes. Then Hatch. Then Briggs, who went in sideways to favor the leg and made it look deliberate. Webb was still watching the southwest. Webb, Ethan said. She's not here yet. I know. Get on the aircraft. Sir? Get on the aircraft, Sergeant. That's not negotiable. Ethan's voice was level. I'll be right behind you. Webb looked at him, looked at the southwest. The rotors were screaming, and the door gunner was scanning, and from somewhere to the south, there was the sound of an engine starting, which was one of the stationary vehicles reaching whatever resolution their command situation had required. Webb got on the aircraft. Ethan stood on the LZ with the wind from the rotors pushing him and looked southwest. She came out of the pre-dawn gray at a jog, coming down the last slope from the south, rifle slung across her back, moving with a controlled urgency that said she'd been running harder than that for the last few minutes and was managing her remaining energy with the same precision she managed everything else. She had a cut on her cheekbone that was bleeding into the collar of her jacket, and she wasn't looking at the wound. She reached the LZ and stopped. "Get on," Ethan said. She looked at the helicopter, at the door, at the aircrew watching her. "That's not my extraction," she said. I don't care whose extraction it is. Get on." A sound from the south. The vehicle, moving now, engine note rising as it pushed forward through the valley. "Captain?" Her voice was flat and direct and completely without drama, which was somehow worse than if she'd been dramatic. "I have a mission. It's not finished." "Your mission is finished. You walked away from it." "I paused it." She looked at him with those level eyes. "There's a difference." He stared at her. The vehicle was getting louder. The door gunner had shifted to track the sound. The pilot was doing that specific weight shifting in the seat that meant I need to make a decision about whether to leave. "Raven, go," she said. "Your people need a hospital." He had 5 seconds, and he spent one of them looking at her face and reading what was there and what wasn't there, and reaching the conclusion that she had made this decision in the way people make decisions that cannot be reversed by argument. He got on the helicopter. The aircraft was lifting before the door was fully closed, nose pitching forward, gaining translational lift and speed simultaneously, the pilots doing what pilots do when a vehicle is rolling toward their position. Through the door gap, Ethan saw the valley floor dropping away below him, saw the vehicle breaking into the open 400 meters south of the LZ, saw the muzzle flash from its forward weapon a moment before the round went wide of the aircraft's climbing tail. He saw the LZ, empty now. He searched the surrounding terrain for a figure moving back up the southwestern slope. He found her chub, barely, in the growing light, a shape among the rocks 200 meters above the valley floor, already moving uphill, already disappearing back into the mountain that had made her. The helicopter banked east and she was gone. Webb was beside him, looking at the same empty mountain. "She went back in," Webb said. "Yeah. What kind of person does that?" Ethan looked at the mountains receding below them, the black granite and the ice and the frozen dark that was just beginning to accept the first pale light of a day that Chalk 7 had not expected to see. "The kind," he said, "that was never really ours to begin with." The helicopter carried them east into the rising light, and the Blackstone Range fell away behind them, keeping its secrets the way mountains always do, patient and permanent, and absolutely indifferent to the small, desperate dramas of the people who passed through them. But that mountain had changed something. In 7 men who would spend the rest of their careers trying to explain what they had witnessed, and in one woman who had already turned her back on the LZ and was climbing back into the dark. The flight took 41 minutes. Ethan spent most of it watching Okafor, who had been moved to the aircraft floor with Park kneeling over him, one hand maintaining pressure on the shoulder wound and the other checking pulse at intervals that were getting shorter as the flight progressed. The flight medic had come forward from the rear compartment within 30 seconds of them lifting off. Read Park's expression correctly, and the two of them had worked without talking except for the specific shorthand of medical personnel managing a shared problem. Numbers, responses, adjustments. Okafor was conscious for the first 20 minutes. His eyes were open and tracking, and at one point he looked directly at Ethan across the length of the aircraft, and Ethan held the look and gave him a single nod that was supposed to communicate something along the lines of, "You're going to be fine," and may have communicated it, or may have communicated nothing at all, because Okafor's expression didn't change. He just looked at Ethan the way people look at things when they are conserving everything for the business of staying alive and have nothing left for expression. At minute 22, his eyes closed. Park's hands moved faster for about 10 seconds, and then settled back into the same rhythm, which Ethan interpreted as a controlled situation rather than a lost one, and he forced himself to look away and look at Briggs instead, who had his back against the aircraft's interior wall, and his wounded leg extended and his eyes closed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who is experiencing something unpleasant and has decided that the most efficient response is to simply wait for it to end. Hatch's arm had stopped bleeding, at least through the dressing. He was looking at the ceiling. Reyes had the radio handset in his lap, and his eyes were on the floor, and he wasn't moving, and he looked, Ethan thought, like a 19-year-old who had spent 8 hours being more afraid than he'd ever been in his life, and had come through it and was now processing the aftermath in the particular private way that people process things they'll be unpacking for years. Webb was sitting beside Ethan, and he hadn't said anything since the observation about Raven on the LZ, and he didn't say anything for the rest of the flight, which was appropriate because there wasn't anything to say that would add to what had already been said. And Webb had always understood that some silences were for keeping rather than filling. The aircraft landed at a forward operating base at 0712 hours, 12 minutes after the official extraction window had opened. Okafor was on a gurney and moving toward the surgical facility before the rotors had stopped. Briggs was helped off by two medics who looked at his leg and exchanged a glance that had a specific kind of clinical resignation in it. Hatch walked off under his own power and stopped outside the aircraft and stood in the early morning light and looked at the mountains visible on the northern horizon, far away now, smaller than they'd seemed from inside them. And then he went where the medics directed him and didn't look at the mountains again. Ethan stepped off the aircraft last and stood on the tarmac and felt the absence of the beacon weight in his chest pocket, which he'd deactivated somewhere over the mountain range when he was certain they were clear. The absence was strange. It had been there for 12 days and then active for what felt like a lifetime, and now it was just a piece of orange polymer in his pocket. He was still standing there, not quite moving, when a man in a colonel's uniform came across the tarmac toward him with the particular walk of someone who is exercising significant restraint over how fast they actually want to move. Colonel David Marsh. Ethan knew him. Chalk 7's support chain ran through Marsh's headquarters Element, which was currently operating from this FOB in a command and coordination capacity. Marsh was 52, a career officer who had spent 20 years not quite reaching the position where people listened to him the way he wanted them to, and had compensated by developing an extremely precise idea of how things were supposed to be done, and a corresponding intolerance for situations that deviated from those specifications. Ethan had worked with him twice before. He did not particularly enjoy working with Marsh. The feeling, he suspected, was mutual. "Cole," Marsh said, stopping 2 feet from him. "Sir?" "I want a full debrief in 30 minutes. Conference room, headquarters building." Marsh was looking at him with a specific expression. Not relief, not concern, not anything that acknowledged the fact that Ethan had just come off a mountain after 8 hours of a combat situation that had been considerably outside normal parameters. The expression was the one people get when they've been in a command post watching a situation develop, and they have questions that they want answered immediately. There are people who need to hear what happened out there. "My men need medical attention, sir." "Your men have medical attention. I need yours in 30 minutes. A pause. 30 minutes, Captain." He turned and walked back toward the headquarters building, and Ethan watched him go and said nothing, which was the correct tactical choice, even if it was not the most satisfying one. Webb had heard the exchange. He was standing just behind Ethan's left shoulder. 30 minutes, Webb said. "Yeah. You haven't slept in 23 hours. I'm aware of that. You've got at least 3 conversations with people who want things from you before anyone offers you a cot. Also aware?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "I could come with you, for the debrief." "No," Ethan said. "Go get your arm looked at." "My arm is fine." "Marcus," Ethan looked at him. "Go get checked. I'll handle Marsh." Webb looked like he wanted to say something else and decided against it. He went toward the medical facility, and Ethan went toward the headquarters building, and they separated the way soldiers separate after shared experiences, without ceremony, without anything that needed to be said, carrying the same memory in different directions. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and recycled air, and the particular institutional blankness of temporary military facilities the world over. There were 4 people in it when Ethan arrived. Marsh at the head of the table, 2 men in civilian clothing that Ethan read immediately as intelligence personnel based on the specific combination of their laptops, their demeanor, and the absence of anything on their persons that would allow quick identification, and a woman in military uniform who introduced herself as Major Teresa Vance from the Judge Advocate's office, which Ethan filed away as a data point that he didn't yet fully understand the significance of. He sat down without being invited to and took the coffee that someone slid toward him because declining it would have been actively stupid given his current state. Walk me through it from your last confirmed safe position, Marsh said. Ethan walked him through it. He'd been trained to give operational after-action reports in the structure that military bureaucracy required: timeline, actions, decisions, outcomes. And he delivered it in that structure, precise and sequential, keeping his voice at the same level throughout. Not editorializing, not emphasizing, just the facts in order. He was on zero sleep and running on the tail end of adrenaline, and he was still better at this than most people were rested, which was something he was aware of without feeling particularly good about. He got to the part about Raven. Marsh stopped him. "Tell me everything about the contact," Marsh said. "From the first shot." Ethan told him. All of it. The initial engagement, the firing positions and repositioning pattern, the call sign identification from the burst transmission, the approach to Chalk 7's position, the conversation, the decision to move with the team, the vehicle interdiction, the refusal to extract. When he finished, the room was quiet for 4 seconds. One of the intelligence personnel, the older one, heavy-set, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, looked at Marsh. Some kind of communication passed between them that didn't involve words. "Captain Cole," the older intelligence man said, "I'm going to ask you some specific questions about this individual, and I need you to understand that your answers are going to be treated as classified at the highest level this facility operates." "I understand." Physical description. Ethan gave it. He was precise. Height estimate, build, approximate age range, distinguishing features including the dark eyes and the wind-burned complexion and the cut on her cheekbone that she hadn't acknowledged. He described the rifle, a custom long-range platform. He estimated caliber at .338 based on the sound signature, with a suppressor that was managing the noise to a level that made position identification difficult at range. He described the unmarked uniform, the absence of insignia, the specific configuration of her tactical kit. The intelligence man wrote in a notebook with a pen, which was unusual enough in this context that Ethan noticed it. "The call sign Raven," the man said. "Had you encountered that call sign before?" "No." "Did she identify herself by any name other than the call sign?" "No." "Did she at any point indicate the nature of her mission or the organization she was operating under?" "No." "She said she was on a mission. She said it wasn't finished. She declined extraction and went back into the mountains." The man looked at his partner briefly and then back at his notebook. "Did she make any reference to having received orders regarding your team? Any suggestion that she had been directed to assist you?" Ethan thought about this carefully, because it was a specific question with a specific implication. "No, she said she'd intercepted our beacon. Her actions suggested she made a unilateral decision to assist." "She told you that?" "Her words were that she'd paused her mission. That implies the decision to redirect was hers." The room was quiet again. Marsh was watching Ethan with an expression that was impossible to read cleanly. It had multiple layers operating simultaneously, which was never a comfortable thing to observe in a commanding officer. "Captain," Marsh said, "I'm going to be direct with you." "I'd appreciate that, sir." The operational picture in this sector is complex. There are assets operating at classification levels that are above this facility's routine access. When your report indicated an unknown shooter with those capabilities operating in the Blackstone Range, it created a situation that requires careful management. Ethan looked at him. "Careful management," he repeated. "The official record of your team's extraction needs to reflect what can be documented and substantiated through normal channels." A beat. Ethan set down the coffee cup with a deliberateness that was not quite a statement, but was adjacent to one. "Sir, I have 7 men who can describe in detail what they witnessed." "But your men are being debriefed separately," Marsh said, "and being advised of the classification requirements surrounding this incident." "You're telling me that Raven gets removed from the record?" Marsh's expression didn't change. "I'm telling you that the official account will reflect your team's tactical proficiency in breaking contact and moving to the extraction LZ under adverse conditions. That narrative is accurate. It simply focuses on the elements that can be properly attributed." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. He was aware of his own fatigue in the specific way he was aware of it when he was pushing through it, not as exhaustion, but as a kind of grinding friction in his thinking, a slight delay between the input and the response. He compensated by slowing down, which sometimes looked like calm and was actually just compensated depletion. "With respect, sir," he said, "a woman went into the Blackstone Range alone, interrupted an enemy operation that had been specifically designed to eliminate my team, cleared multiple enemy positions in conditions that I don't have adequate vocabulary to describe as anything other than extraordinary, and then went back into those mountains to finish a mission she walked away from to help us. And the institutional response to that is to make it not have happened." Marsh's jaw tightened by a degree that Ethan measured precisely and filed away. "That is not what I said." "It's what you described, sir." "What I described is the management of classified information in a way that protects operational security and the safety of personnel whose activities cannot be officially acknowledged." Marsh leaned forward slightly. "Captain, I understand you feel strongly about this, but you don't have the full picture. Then give it to me." A silence. The intelligence man with the notebook looked at the ceiling briefly, which was the posture of someone who has decided they're not going to participate in the next 60 seconds of conversation. "The individual who assisted your team," Marsh said, choosing each word with the precision of someone navigating something that has edges, operates under parameters that are outside the normal command structure. "Her activities in this sector were not sanctioned by this headquarters. When she intercepted your beacon and chose to redirect, she made a decision that has significant implications for an ongoing operation that extends well beyond your team's mission." "What kind of implications?" "The kind that are above your clearance level, Captain." Ethan absorbed that. "Is she in trouble?" Something moved across Marsh's face that wasn't quite an answer but was close enough to one that Ethan felt it land. "The situation is being reviewed at levels above this headquarters," Marsh said. "Your report will be one input into that review, which is why it's important that your report accurately reflects what can be verified and attributed." Ethan looked at the major from the judge advocate's office, who had been silent for the entire exchange and had the careful neutrality of someone who is witnessing something they are prepared to document accurately and have made professional decisions about how to feel about it. "Major Vance," he said. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was not surprised to be addressed. "If I submit a report that omits material facts about a combat incident," he said, "what is my legal exposure?" Vance's expression didn't change. "That would depend on the specific nature of the omission and the directives under which it was made," she said carefully. "If I'm directed to omit those facts by a superior officer, then the legal architecture shifts in specific ways," she said, "that I would be glad to discuss with you privately." Marsh looked at Vance with the expression of a man who had not fully accounted for that variable when he had decided to have her present. "Captain Cole," Marsh said, redirecting, "I am not asking you to falsify anything. I am asking you to be judicious about the scope of your report in a manner consistent with the classification requirements of this incident. That is a normal operational requirement that you have navigated before." Ethan looked at him. Marsh was not entirely wrong. It was normal in a narrow technical sense. You redacted things. You kept certain information compartmentalized. You wrote reports that were accurate within their scope without that scope being the complete picture. He had done it. The system required it, and the system had reasons for requiring it. But there was a difference between routine operational security and erasing a person who had spent a night on a frozen mountain, eliminating the threat that a larger institutional apparatus had failed to prevent. "I'll submit my report," Ethan said, "within the classification requirements you've described. I'll need those requirements in writing, with the specific authority cited." Marsh looked at him. "Standard practice, sir," Ethan said. "When I'm asked to limit the scope of a report, I need the directing authority documented. That protects everyone." The pause that followed was the kind of pause in which several things were being considered simultaneously. The intelligence man with the notebook had gone very still. "That can be arranged," Marsh said finally. "Then I'll have my report to you within 6 hours," Ethan said, "after I've slept." He stood up because the debrief was over in the way that things are over when someone has decided they're over. Marsh could have pushed back on that and technically had the standing to do so, but Marsh was a man who preferred to win his engagements through institutional process rather than direct confrontation, and Ethan had just structured the situation in a way that made direct confrontation inconvenient. He left the conference room and stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand against the wall, and let himself be very tired for about 15 seconds. The kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and in the joints of your fingers and in every muscle you've been telling to cooperate since approximately 3 in the morning. Then he went to the medical facility. Okafor was out of surgery and in recovery, which a nurse relayed to Ethan with the specific qualified positivity of medical professionals who don't want to promise things that haven't yet been proven. The surgery had gone 2 hours, and the shoulder damage had been significant, and there was going to be a recovery that would be measured in months rather than weeks. And there was a conversation to be had about long-term functional prognosis, but he was out of surgery and his vitals were stable, which was the sentence that mattered most right now. Briggs was in a different bay, his leg cleaned and packed and immobilized, being told by a young orthopedic surgeon that he'd need further intervention at a larger facility, and that the field closure he'd done himself on the mountainside was, and here the surgeon had paused in the specific way people pause when they're recalibrating what they were about to say, entirely competent under the circumstances. Hatch's arm had been properly cleaned and stitched, and he was sitting on the edge of a bed eating crackers from a foil packet and looking at nothing in particular. Reyes was in a chair in the waiting area, and he was on the phone, his own phone, personal, not operational. And whoever he was talking to, he was talking quietly, and one of his hands was covering his eyes, not in distress, but in the particular way people cover their eyes when they are hearing a voice they needed to hear for a while and have finally heard it. His mother, Ethan guessed. He'd seen that specific combination before. He found Park in a break room, sitting at a table with both hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the surface of the liquid with the defocused expression of a man who has been running on medical expertise and suppressed emotion for 8 hours and has just located the edge of his own capacity. Ethan sat down across from him. Park looked up. His eyes had the red-rimmed quality of someone who had not cried but had been close to it more than once in the last few hours, and had managed it through the discipline of keeping his hands busy. "Okafor," Park said. "Stable," Ethan said. Park nodded slowly. He looked back at the mug. "I kept thinking about the transfusion window, the whole time we were moving. If we'd taken the longer route, we didn't. But if we had..." "Park," Ethan waited until the medic looked at him. "You kept him moving. You kept him stable on a mountainside with what you had in your kit. That's what you did." Park held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, which was not disagreement but wasn't full acceptance either. He'd get there on his own schedule. Webb found Ethan outside the medical facility 40 minutes later, sitting on a concrete step with his back against the building wall and his eyes closed, not sleeping but not quite awake either. "Debrief," Webb said, sitting beside him. "Done." "And?" Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the mountains on the northern horizon for a moment, the Blackstone Range visible from here as a dark line of peaks against the morning sky, indifferent and enormous, and exactly the same as they had been 8 hours ago and 100 years ago. "They're going to manage the report," he said. Webb was quiet. "Raven doesn't appear in the official version," Ethan said. "Chalk 7 achieved tactical discipline and broke contact under its own initiative. That's the story. That's not what happened." "No." Ethan looked at his hands, which were still faintly marked with the cold, that particular whiteness at the knuckle joints that took a few hours to fully normalize. "It's not." "Are you going to push back?" "I push back on the process, got the directing authority in writing. That's what I can do within the system right now." Webb stared at the horizon. "And Raven. She's apparently complicated, operating outside the normal structure. The intervention created problems for something bigger that I don't have visibility on. So she saves 7 lives and gets investigated for it. I don't know what happens to her," Ethan said. "I don't have that visibility either." "That's a bad sentence," Webb said. "Yes, it is." They sat in silence for a while. The base was operational around them. Vehicles moving, personnel crossing the compound, the distant sound of aircraft on the other side of the facility. The normal machinery of a military installation proceeding with the normal indifference of machinery to the specific experiences of the people who operate within it. "Her kit," Webb said eventually. "What about it? The rifle, the suppressor quality, the tactical setup with no insignia." Webb was working through something. "The way she moved," The positioning she chose, the way she read the vehicle threat and responded to it, that's not something you develop in standard training pipelines. No, Ethan agreed. The challenge word, Webb said. She knew the current challenge word for this sector. She did. That's compartmentalized information, rotated every 72 hours. Webb looked at him. She had it. Ethan had been sitting with that specific fact since the LZ, filing it in the accumulating folder of things about Raven that didn't fit together into a simple explanation. The challenge word was not information that circulated through normal channels. You got it if you were operating in the sector and you had the clearance to need it, which meant you had a specific kind of access. Marsh said she operates outside the normal command structure, Ethan said. But she had current sector authentication. Those two things don't belong in the same description, unless the normal command structure has more architecture than we can see. Ethan looked at him. Webb shrugged. I'm just saying, there are programs that run parallel to the structure without running through it. We know they exist. We don't know what they look like from the inside. And you think she's one of those? I think a woman who can clear a 6-man blocking position alone in the dark at altitude and then make a 1,000-meter shot on a vehicle commander from an improvised firing position while repositioning to avoid detection is not something that happens by accident. Webb paused. That's built, deliberately, over time, by someone with resources and a specific intention. Ethan thought about the handwritten sentence that Major Vance had mentioned almost in passing. Something someone had told her about the investigation framework, a detail that wasn't meant for him, but that he'd caught because he was still running the part of his brain that catches things even when the rest of him is exhausted. Something about a file that predated the current operation by a significant margin, with a classification designation that Vance had declined to repeat, but that her expression had told him was considerably above this facility's access level. He didn't share that with Webb because he wasn't sure yet what to do with it himself. Get some rest, he said instead. Webb looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has more to say and has calculated that now is not the time to say it. When are you writing the report? After I sleep. What's going in it? Ethan looked at the mountains again, at the dark line of the Blackstone Range against the brightening sky, at the place where, somewhere, a woman in an unmarked uniform was still moving through terrain that didn't care about her any more than it had cared about Chalk 7. The truth, he said, within the limits of what I can put in writing. Webb absorbed this and didn't push further. He got up and went back inside and left Ethan on the step, which was where Ethan needed to be for a while longer, in the specific kind of alone that isn't loneliness, but is the necessary quiet that comes after something that takes things out of you. He sat there until the cold started getting into his joints, which was maybe 30 minutes. Then he went inside and found a cot in the transit facility and lay down and was unconscious inside 4 minutes, which was a skill he developed over 12 years because sleep was ammunition and you used it when you had access. He did not dream, but in the space between closing his eyes and losing consciousness, the image that came was not the ambush or the mountain or the aircraft lifting off the LZ. It was the figure on the southwestern slope, 200 meters above the valley floor, moving back up into the dark. Already past where he could reach her. Already gone back to whatever she'd been doing before their emergency had interrupted it. Moving like she'd never stopped at all. He slept for 6 hours and woke up with his boots still on. The transit facility was dim and quiet around him. 2 other cots occupied by men he didn't know who were sleeping with the specific immobility of people who had earned it. His body reported its damages in the sequential way it always did after operations. The knee first, then the shoulder he'd landed on hard against the boulder at some point around 0300 that he'd forgotten about during the engagement because pain had been the least of his problems. Then the general full-body stiffness of a man who had been cold and moving and afraid for 8 consecutive hours. He sat up slowly and checked his watch. 14:31 hours. He found a bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror for a moment, which was not a particularly encouraging exercise. The face that looked back at him had the specific quality of faces that have been outside in extreme cold and then inside in recycled air. Drawn, slightly gray, the eyes showing the particular blankness that follows extended adrenaline exposure when the adrenaline has finally been used up and there's nothing left to replace it with yet. He splashed water on his face and went to find coffee. The FOB's dining facility was running a late lunch service, and he took a tray and sat at a table near the window and ate without tasting anything, which was fine. Food was fuel, and he needed fuel. He ate everything on the tray, including the things that were difficult to identify, and then got a second coffee and sat with it and let his brain come back online gradually, the way engines come back in cold weather, reluctantly, in stages, with sounds that aren't exactly reassuring. He was on the second coffee when Webb sat down across from him carrying his own tray. Webb looked better than Ethan felt, which was possible because Webb had the kind of constitution that processed sleep as a genuine reset rather than a temporary patch. He'd changed clothes and his arm had a clean dressing, and he looked almost normal if you didn't know him well enough to see the specific tightness around his eyes that said he'd been thinking about things while he slept instead of actually resting. "Okafor's awake," Webb said. Ethan looked up. "And?" "Asking for his phone, which the nurses say he can't have in recovery. He asked what time it was, and when they told him, he said, 'That's not right,' and went back to sleep." Ethan felt something loosen slightly in his chest that had been there since he'd watched Okafor's eyes close on the helicopter. "He's going to be all right." Park says yes, with qualifications about physical therapy and recovery timelines that I stopped listening to after the yes part. "And Briggs?" "Being transferred to the surgical facility at Crestholm this evening. They want a specialist to look at the leg." Webb paused. "He's annoyed about the transfer. He wanted to stay here." "Of course he did." "He also wants to know if anyone recovered his pack from the mountain." "His pack is on a mountain at 11,000 feet surrounded by a significant amount of evidence that a very complicated evening took place." I told him that. He said, "I know what he said." They sat with that for a moment. "Hatch and Reyes are cleared," Webb said. Reyes specifically. "He came through clean, which I wasn't entirely sure about." "He did better than clean," Ethan said. "He did his job in conditions that a lot of people with more experience wouldn't have managed." Webb nodded. "You going to tell him that?" "When I write the evaluation." "Tell him now. He's 19 and he spent last night thinking he was going to die, and he's sitting in the transit facility trying to figure out how he feels about the fact that he didn't." Ethan looked at Webb. Webb had a way sometimes of stating things very directly that Ethan had been approaching obliquely, which was one of the things that made him valuable and occasionally uncomfortable in equal measure. "After I deal with Marsh," Ethan said. Webb's expression shifted slightly. "Speaking of which, he wants you in the conference room at 1500. Ethan checked his watch. 22 minutes. "What does he want?" "He didn't confide his intentions in me personally," Webb said, "but there were 2 vehicles that arrived at the facility about 2 hours ago with people in them who aren't from this headquarters. And shortly after that, Marsh started looking like someone who'd received instructions that adjusted his original plan." Ethan turned that over. "What kind of vehicles?" "Unmarked, which at a forward operating base means very specifically marked, just not with anything visible." Ethan drank his coffee and thought about the intelligence man with the notebook who had been writing with a pen, and Major Vance, and the directing authority in writing that Marsh had agreed to produce, and the file that Vance's expression had told him existed somewhere above this facility's access level, and the 2 unmarked vehicles that had arrived 2 hours ago. "All right," he said, and stood up. The conference room had been rearranged, not significantly. The same table, the same chairs, but the orientation had shifted, and there were now 6 people in it instead of 4, and the 2 new people were the ones that Ethan's training and experience and 12 years of reading rooms caused him to identify immediately as the people who actually had authority over everything else that was happening. One was a man in his late 50s, civilian clothes, no identification visible, who sat at the table with the particular stillness of someone who has been in many rooms with many people making many decisions, and has arrived at a state of almost perfect economy of motion as a result. Gray hair. Unremarkable face. Eyes that moved with a precision that was not unremarkable at all. The other was a woman, also civilian. Younger. Mid-40s, perhaps. Dark hair cut short, a slight build, a dark blue jacket that was expensive in the understated way that things are expensive when they're not trying to announce themselves. She had a single manila folder on the table in front of her, closed, and her hands were folded on top of it. Marsh was there. He looked, Ethan thought, like a man who had been in possession of a plan for 12 hours and had received information within the last 2 that had required significant revision of that plan. Ethan sat down and looked at the people at the table and waited. "Captain Cole," the gray-haired man said. "My name is Harlan. I work for an office that you don't have direct contact with through your current assignment. The woman beside me is Director Lena Sato. She's going to explain the parts of this that are relevant to you." Ethan looked at Director Sato. She opened the manila folder. She looked at whatever was in it for a moment, then looked at Ethan. 6 days before your team's extraction, she said, a significant intelligence asset was compromised in the northern sector, an operation that had been in development for 14 months. The compromise required immediate response, which included deploying a specific capability into the Blackstone Range to recover what could be recovered before the situation became permanent. She paused, giving him a moment to follow. "That capability," Ethan said, "was Raven." "Yes." No hesitation, no deflection, direct. He appreciated that. She was 14 hours into a 36-hour operational window when your team's beacon activated. She intercepted the signal. She made a decision. She abandoned a 14-month operation to help 7 soldiers. She redirected, Sato said, with a slight emphasis that was not quite a correction. 14 months of preparation produced a capability that was flexible enough to pause and resume. The core objective was achieved, ultimately, delayed by approximately 11 hours. Ethan processed this. She went back into the mountains and completed her original mission. Yes. After a night of... He paused because the words available to describe Raven's previous 8 hours were inadequate to the facts. Significant physical and operational expenditure. She completed it, Sato said simply. That's the relevant fact. Marsh was quiet at the end of the table, in the posture of someone who has been specifically instructed not to be the primary speaker in this conversation and is complying with that instruction without fully embracing it. "The concern about your report," Ethan said, "wasn't really about operational security." Sato's expression didn't change. "The concern was multifactorial. Operational security was one factor. Another was that the specific capability Raven represents, the specific parameters of how she operates and what she can do, is not something that benefits from appearing in official military records that move through multiple review chains. You didn't want anyone to know what she could do." "We didn't want the wrong people to know," Sato said. "There is a meaningful difference." Ethan looked at the folder in front of her. "What's in there?" She considered that for a moment. Then she turned the folder around and pushed it across the table to him. He opened it. There was a photograph on top, a surveillance image, aerial angle, showing a mountain ridge. In the center of the image, barely visible against the terrain, was a human figure. The scale marker in the corner of the image told him the figure was approximately 1,100 meters from the camera. The figure was in a firing position, prone, using a natural rock formation as a rest. The thermal overlay in the corner of the image showed the heat signature of a recently fired weapon. Below the photograph were 3 pages of text, heavily redacted, with more black bars than legible content. What was legible was a series of confirmed engagements spanning, he looked at the dates, 4 years. Different countries, different theaters, different operational contexts, all of them sharing certain characteristics: single operator, no supporting element, high-value targets or high-stakes situations, outcomes that had been documented as significant in each case. And in every case, the operator had been present without official authorization and had left without official acknowledgement. At the bottom of the last page, unredacted, was a single line that had apparently been allowed to remain visible by design rather than oversight. Asset designation, Raven. Operational status, active. Recognition status, none. He looked at that last word for a moment. None. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "She's never been formally recognized," he said. It wasn't a question. "The nature of what she does," Sato said, "makes formal recognition complicated." "Complicated," Ethan repeated. He kept his voice even. "She has been doing this for 4 years. The way those engagement records read, she's changed outcomes in situations that would not have resolved favorably without her. And the institutional response is to document it in a folder that no one will see and call her recognition status none. Captain, I understand the security architecture, he said. I understand why her activities can't be publicly acknowledged. I'm not asking for a parade. He paused. Does she know what's in that folder? Sato was quiet for 2 seconds. She knows we track her activities. That's not the same thing. No, Sato said. It isn't. The room was quiet. Harlan, the gray-haired man, had been watching the exchange with the still attention of someone who had expected something like this and was observing rather than managing. What do you need from me? Ethan said. Your report, Sato said. Written accurately and completely, not the limited version Colonel Marsh initially requested. Marsh looked at the table. The original concern, Sato continued, was that your report would enter the standard review chain and Raven's activities would become visible to people we didn't want to have that visibility. That concern was valid when Marsh raised it. It's been superseded. She folded her hands on the folder. Your report will go into a specific compartmentalized review, not the standard chain. Your men's testimony will be collected under the same parameters. And then what? Ethan said. And then it becomes part of a record that acknowledges, in the appropriate context, at the appropriate level, what happened in the Blackstone Range. Does she see that record? A longer pause this time. That can be arranged, Sato said, and her voice had something different in it than it had before. Not quite personal, but something that had moved slightly closer to it. Ethan looked at her and understood, in the way he sometimes understood things about people by reading what they didn't say, that Sato's relationship to Raven was not purely administrative. There was something in the way she had said that last sentence that can be arranged, that carried the specific weight of someone who owes something and is looking at an opportunity to begin paying it. One more thing, he said. Sato waited. She needs to know it mattered, Ethan said. Whatever you put in whatever record you're describing, she needs to know that it's there, that 7 people are alive because of a decision she made, and that it's documented somewhere by someone who has the standing to document it. Sato looked at him for a long moment. I'll see to it personally, she said. He believed her. He wrote the report that afternoon, sitting at a desk in a small office that Marsh's aide found for him, with the door closed and a fresh coffee and the complete, unedited account of everything that had happened in the Blackstone Range from the moment Chalk 7 walked into the ambush until the moment the helicopter lifted off the LZ. He wrote it in the structured military format he'd been trained in, and he wrote it with the precision that the situation deserved, which meant he was there for 3 hours and 40 minutes, because precision of this kind takes time. He wrote about the ambush and the positions and the ammunition count and the beacon activation. He wrote about the shots from the northern peaks and the burst transmission and the 3 letters on the radio display. He wrote about the figure coming out of the pre-dawn gray and the challenge word and the direct, level eyes and the cut on the cheekbone that she hadn't acknowledged. He wrote about the traverse and the choke point and the vehicle interdiction and the vehicle commander who hadn't made it. He wrote about the LZ and the argument and the refusal to board and the figure moving back up the southwestern slope into the dark. He wrote all of it, and he wrote it accurately, and when he read it back, he felt the particular satisfaction of having said a true thing correctly, which was one of the few clean feelings available in work that was mostly defined by ambiguity. He submitted it through the compartmentalized channel that Sato's office had provided. Then, he went to find Reyes. The kid was in the transit facility common room, sitting with a paperback book that he wasn't reading, which was evident from the fact that the page hadn't turned in the 4 minutes Ethan stood in the doorway before Reyes noticed him and closed the book with the quick, slightly guilty movement of someone who'd been caught doing something they weren't sure was allowed. "Sir," Reyes said, sitting up straighter. "At ease." Ethan sat down in the chair across from him. "How are you?" Reyes looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone being asked a question that has a very long answer and a very short one and isn't sure which one is appropriate. "I'm fine, sir. Arm's a little sore from the cold, but the medic said that's just circulation." "That's not what I asked." Reyes was quiet. He turned the paper back over in his hands once, then set it on the seat beside him. "It was my first one," he said. First real engagement. I know. I kept thinking. He stopped, started again. I kept thinking about all the things I was supposed to do and whether I was doing them and whether I was messing up, and then at some point I stopped thinking about it and just did it. He paused. Is that how it's supposed to work? Pretty much, Ethan said. It doesn't feel... Rhea searched for the word. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would feel afterward. I thought I'd feel something specific, but it's kind of just flat, Ethan said. Reyes looked at him quickly. Yes. That's normal. Give it time. Does the flat part go away? Ethan considered being careful about this and decided that careful wasn't what was needed. It changes. It doesn't exactly go away. But you figure out where to put it. Reyes nodded slowly, processing this with the focused attention he applied to things he was trying to understand correctly. You did your job last night, Ethan said. You kept the radio working under conditions that would have justified giving up on it. You carried weight for the whole movement. You stayed in your lane when things got complicated, and that's not a small thing. He paused. When I write your evaluation, that's what's going in it. But I wanted to say it to you directly. Reyes looked at him. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when people are managing something they don't want to show. Yes, sir, he said. Thank you, sir. Get some rest. Ethan left him there and went back through the facility and found Hatch in the medical bay getting his arm dressing changed and told him essentially the same thing in shorter words because Hatch processed praise the way he processed most things, efficiently and without much use for elaboration. Hatch said, yes, sir, and I know, in that order, and that was the end of it. He checked on Okafor one more time before the day was done. Okafor was awake and more alert, his color coming back in increments, and he looked at Ethan from the hospital bed with eyes that were clearer than they'd been since the shoulder wound and said, Did we make it? You're in a medical facility, Ethan said. What does that suggest? That either we made it or this is a very strange afterlife. Okafor shifted slightly, then stopped because shifting hurt. The shooter. What about them? Did she make it? Ethan looked at him. She wasn't extracted with us. Okafor was quiet for a moment. But she's okay. As far as I know, Okafor absorbed this. She saved my life, specifically. He said it carefully, precisely, giving each word its due weight. If those vehicles had reached the valley, the helicopters don't land. And without a transfusion in the next... He stopped. She saved my life specifically. Yes, Ethan said. She did. Will she know that? I'm working on making sure of it. Okafor looked at him for a moment with the particular directness that near-death experiences seem to install in people as a kind of residual effect. Good, he said, and then closed his eyes. 2 weeks later, back at the main base, processing through the administrative requirements of return from deployment, the equipment turn-in, the medical follow-ups, the debrief with the battalion intelligence officer who asked questions that Ethan answered within the scope of his compartmentalized clearances. A package arrived for him. It was unremarkable. A padded envelope, standard military post, addressed to him with his full rank and name, no return address. The postmark was from a postal facility that served several different regional hubs and couldn't be used to narrow down the origin. Inside was a photograph. He recognized the terrain immediately. The Blackstone Range, taken from a high point looking southeast, the valley where they'd crossed visible in the middle distance, the mountain range layered behind it in gradients of dark. The photograph had been taken in daylight, which meant after their extraction, and from an elevation that suggested the photographer was well into the upper ridgeline area when they'd taken it. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, facing away from the camera toward the horizon, stood a figure. The distance was too great for facial features, but the build, the rifle slung across the back, the unmarked tactical setup, Ethan knew who it was the way you know certain things without being able to explain the knowing exactly. She was standing at the edge of the ridge, looking out at the range, looking at what she'd come back into and what she'd moved through and what she'd finished. Below the photograph, on a small card in careful handwriting that was economical and precise the way everything about her was economical and precise, 7 people who refused to quit. That's worth pausing a mission for. Don't waste it. Ethan looked at the card for a long time. He thought about the official version of events and the compartmentalized version and the folder with the redacted pages and the words, recognition status, none. He thought about Sato's promise, I'll see to it personally, and whether promises made in conference rooms under operational pressure carried the weight of the rooms they were made in. He thought about Okafor asking will she know from a hospital bed with a shoulder that was going to take 8 months to fully recover. He put the photograph on his desk, leaning against the wall, where he could see it from the chair he used when he wrote reports. Not prominently, not as a display, just present, in the room. Webb saw it 2 days later when he came by to drop off a piece of equipment Ethan had left in the team room. Webb stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph for a moment and didn't say anything about it, which was the correct response. Okafor starts physical therapy next week, Webb said. I know. Briggs's surgeon says 12 weeks to full weight bearing. He's already arguing about the timeline. Of course he is. Reyes put in a request for advanced signals training. His evaluation went in last week. Good. Webb was quiet. He was still looking at the photograph from the doorway. We're not going to know what happens to her, he said. Not a question. Probably not, Ethan said. And she knows that. She knew that when she did it. Yes. Webb nodded once, slowly, absorbing this the way he absorbed most things, completely, then setting it somewhere internal where it would stay. All right, he said, and put the equipment on the corner of the desk and left. Ethan sat in his chair and looked at the photograph. A mountain, a ridgeline, a figure looking toward a horizon that didn't care about her any more than it cared about anyone else. He thought about the 7 men who had stood on that mountain in the dark, with 17 rounds between them, and accepted, in the specific private way that people accept things they can't change, that sunrise was probably not coming. And then it had come anyway, from a direction nobody was watching and in a form nobody had planned for, because someone had made a decision that the math on a frozen mountainside at 3 a.m. was not the final math. The card said 7 people who refused to quit. He disagreed slightly with the framing. Chalk 7 had refused to quit because that was what they'd been trained to do, and because the alternative was worse, and because there weren't any other options. That was one kind of courage, the kind that keeps going because stopping isn't available. What she had done was different. She had stopped what she was doing and chosen something else. In a moment when no one was watching and no record would be kept and no recognition would follow, she had looked at someone else's impossible situation and decided that it was worth more than whatever she'd been sent there to accomplish. That was not trained. That was not institutional. That was something that came from inside a person, or it didn't come at all. And it had come from her. He picked up a pen and opened the small notebook he kept for things that weren't reports, observations, notes to himself, the kind of unstructured thinking that didn't fit in official formats. He wrote one line, not for any official purpose, not for any audience. She changed the math and then disappeared before anyone could thank her. That's either the saddest thing or the most complete thing I've ever seen. I haven't decided which yet. He looked at what he'd written, closed the notebook. Outside, the mountains were where they always were. Patient, indifferent, enormous, keeping whatever they held without needing to be asked. Somewhere in them, probably, a woman was moving through terrain that didn't care about her toward an objective that no one outside a small classified file would ever know about, carrying whatever she carried and doing what she did because that was the decision she'd made about who she was going to be. Not for recognition, not for the record, not for the photograph that she had sent from a ridge she'd already moved past and wasn't going back to. For the 7 people who were alive instead of not. That was enough for her. Ethan understood finally that it was genuinely enough. Not a rationalization, not a resignation, but a real and chosen sufficiency. The kind that most people spend their whole lives looking for and only a few ever actually find. He put the notebook in the desk drawer. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he went to work. The rarest kind of courage doesn't ask to be seen. It simply does what needs to be done, and trusts that somewhere, in someone, it will be remembered.